Imagine waking up with no alarm clock, no boss, and no deadlines waiting for you. You stretch, breathe in the morning air, and your main responsibilities are finding food, exploring the landscape, and spending time with a close-knit group of people who have your back. For ancient humans living as hunter-gatherers, that was normal life. Sounds pretty good, right? Now imagine waking before sunrise every single day because animals need feeding, fields need tending, weeds need removing, and an entire harvest depends on your work. If that harvest fails, your children could go hungry. There are no weekends, no vacations, no easy way to change your mind. You are tied both physically and economically to one small piece of land. For most of human history, our ancestors lived somewhere between these two lifestyles. Or more accurately, over thousands of years, ancient human societies gradually moved from one way of life into another, and most of the people living through that transition never really got to choose. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions in archaeology and anthropology. Who actually had the better life? The ancient human hunter-gatherer, who was mobile and relatively free? Or the early farmer who was settled and productive? The answer is going to surprise you. And the deeper we look into ancient human history, the more complicated it becomes. Let's begin with the world that existed for the overwhelming majority of human existence. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived primarily as hunter-gatherers. That's an enormous amount of time. Agriculture, by comparison, has existed for only about 12,000 years. If you compress the entire history of our species into a single day, farming would appear during only the final 28 minutes. So in a very real biological and psychological sense, modern humans are still ancient hunter-gatherers living inside a relatively recent civilization. But what was life actually like for these ancient humans? First, forget the familiar image of a primitive caveman dragging a club through the mud. The evidence tells us something very different. Ancient hunter-gatherers were, in many measurable ways, incredibly successful generalists. They spread across almost every environment on Earth. They adapted to deserts, rainforests, Arctic tundra, grasslands, and open savannas. They had to be flexible, intelligent, observant, and extremely good at understanding their surroundings. Research involving modern hunter-gatherer groups such as the Kung of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Agta of the Philippines suggests that some groups spent roughly 15 to 20 hours per week obtaining the basic necessities of life. That number sounds almost impossible by modern standards. Anthropologist Marshall Solins famously described hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society. Not because ancient humans had enormous amounts of material wealth. They didn't. They were affluent in something modern people often struggle to find. Time. And what did they do with that time? They socialized. They rested. They told stories. They played with their children. They created music, art, rituals, and traditions. Archaeological sites from the Upper Paleolithic, particularly during the explosion of creativity beginning around 40,000 years ago, contain evidence of sophisticated symbolic thinking. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative objects, musical instruments made from bone. These discoveries completely change the way we should imagine ancient humans. They were not simply desperate creatures constantly fighting to survive from one meal to another. They were curious, creative people who had developed highly effective ways of finding food and had enough time left over to think about things beyond immediate survival. Their diet was also remarkably diverse. Studies of skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer populations often reveal strong bone development, relatively good dental health, and fewer signs of nutritional deficiency than are seen in many early farming populations. The Hadza today, for example, consume a remarkable variety of plant and animal foods throughout the year. That is very different from the narrow diets that became common after agriculture. Compare that with many modern Western diets which depend heavily on a relatively small number of domesticated crops and animals, and the nutritional advantage of variety becomes much easier to understand. But ancient hunter-gatherers had another advantage that became increasingly rare once agriculture appeared: social equality. Many mobile foraging societies were strongly egalitarian. And they developed powerful social mechanisms to stop individuals from accumulating too much power or wealth. One of these mechanisms is often called leveling. If someone in the group started behaving as though they were more important than everyone else, the rest of the group could mock them, criticize them, exclude them, refuse to cooperate, or stop sharing resources with them. In extreme situations, someone who repeatedly abused their position could even be removed from the group. There was almost a humorous simplicity to the system. You bring home a huge animal. Everyone appreciates it. But start bragging about how impressive you are, and your companions might quickly remind you that the animal was actually small, skinny, and barely worth mentioning. This was more than simple social teasing. It helped prevent wealth and authority from becoming concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. Now compare this ancient human lifestyle with what happened after agriculture appeared. Farming did not simply change what people ate. It transformed almost every part of human society. It changed who owned land, who controlled resources, who had power, who worked, who went hungry, and ultimately what everyday life felt like from the inside. Agriculture developed independently in multiple parts of the world. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes. And in many of these places, ancient human societies experienced surprisingly similar changes. Here is the part that surprises many people when they first learn about it. The arrival of farming appears to have made life worse for the average person, at least initially. And in several ways, those disadvantages lasted for generations. The skeletal evidence is difficult to ignore. When archaeologists compare the remains of hunter-gatherers with those of early farmers living in similar regions, the farmers often show signs of poorer health. They were frequently shorter. They show more evidence of childhood nutritional stress. Their teeth contain more cavities, partly because of diets heavily dependent on starch. There are higher signs of infectious disease. Their skeletons show damage associated with repetitive physical labor. And iron deficiency anemia sometimes appears in the eye sockets as a distinctive condition known as cribroorbitalia. These aren't minor differences. They are physical evidence of ancient human populations experiencing significant biological stress. So why did farming create these problems? One major explanation is something known as dietary narrowing. When humans began farming, they concentrated much of their food production around a small number of crops. In the Fertile Crescent, that meant wheat and barley. In China, millet and rice. In parts of the Americas, maize became especially important. These crops had one enormous advantage. They produced large quantities of calories. That was exactly why ancient humans cultivated them. But calories are not the same as complete nutrition. A diet dominated by a few staple crops can lack certain amino acids, vitamins, and minerals that a varied hunter-gatherer diet provides much more easily. And when the harvest failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. There was no simple backup plan. You couldn't just move into the next valley and search for something else to eat. That land might already belong to another community. And this leads to another fundamental change brought by agriculture: ownership. Especially ownership of land. Hunter-gatherers generally owned relatively few material possessions, and their social structures often discouraged large-scale accumulation. Farmers were different. They invested months of labor into specific pieces of land. They cleared fields, they built fences, they constructed irrigation channels. They created storage facilities. They planted crops that would not produce a return for months. That investment created a claim. And once land became something that could be claimed, those claims needed protection. Protection required organized force. Organized force encouraged armies. Armies supported rulers. Rulers demanded taxes. And gradually, increasingly complex systems of hierarchy and coercion emerged. The first cities grew out of agricultural surpluses. Those surpluses supported people who didn't personally produce food. Priests, soldiers, scribes, craft workers, administrators. It sounds like progress, and in the long-term sense it absolutely was. But for the ancient farmers producing that surplus, the experience was often much less impressive. They worked longer hours. Their diets could become less diverse. They lived in close contact with domesticated animals. And that increased contact created new opportunities for diseases to move between animals and humans. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza eventually became devastating human illnesses. Dense settlements made things even worse. When hundreds or thousands of people lived close together, infections could spread quickly and travel farther. From an epidemiological perspective, some early agricultural settlements were essentially disease factories. So if farming had so many disadvantages, why did ancient humans adopt it? This is where the story becomes especially interesting. Because the honest answer is, most people probably never consciously chose it. The transition was gradual. It happened unevenly. And once it began, reversing the process became increasingly difficult. In many places, farming did not suddenly replace hunting and gathering. Instead, the two lifestyles existed side by side. People might cultivate a few useful plants near their camps while continuing to hunt animals and gather wild foods. Then they cultivated a little more. The population increased. And that created another demand for food. More people required more calories. More calories encouraged more cultivation. More cultivation supported even more people. It became a kind of ratchet. Once the process moved forward, going backward became increasingly difficult. Historian and anthropologist James C. Scott described this relationship through the idea of a world of domestication, where humans, plants, and animals became caught in a process of mutual transformation. None of them necessarily planned it. None of them individually designed the system. Wheat did not decide that it wanted humans to cultivate it. Cattle did not decide to become dependent on people. And the ancient farmer did not necessarily wake up one morning and think, I would love to give up much of my leisure time for repetitive agricultural labor, a starch-heavy diet, and a damaged back. It developed gradually. Humans, plants, and animals became part of the same system. But we need to be careful here. Because the ancient hunter-gatherer lifestyle was not paradise. Not even close. Romanticizing it would simply create another misleading version of ancient human history. Violence was a genuine problem. Studies of skeletal remains from prehistoric populations show significant levels of traumatic injury and violent death. Anthropologist Lawrence Keeley, in his influential research on prehistoric warfare, argued that some hunter-gatherer societies experienced extremely high levels of violent death. These were not universally peaceful communities wandering through an untouched paradise. Groups could fight over territory. They could compete for water. They could raid neighboring communities. And archaeological sites around the world contain evidence of that violence. Then there was childhood mortality. Ancient humans had no antibiotics, no modern surgery, no reliable treatment for infections, no advanced methods for managing difficult childbirth. Losing children was an extremely common experience. Estimates suggest that in many prehistoric populations, somewhere around 40 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. That reality is almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. The freedom of a short work week and the diversity of a hunter-gatherer diet look very different when you remember that grief was deeply woven into everyday life. Food shortages were always possible. One bad season could change everything. The Hadza, for example, may spend only a limited number of hours working during an average week, but averages hide enormous variation. There are seasons of abundance, and there are seasons when the environment simply does not provide enough. Hunter-gatherers developed sophisticated systems to survive those fluctuations. They shared food. They created reciprocal relationships. They built extensive social networks. They passed detailed ecological knowledge from one generation to the next. But even the best social system cannot make a drought disappear. It cannot magically replace an animal herd that has moved somewhere else. And that brings us to the hardest question of all. What exactly do we mean by better? Better according to whom? Ahad's a hunter who knows the plants, animals, and landscape around him intimately, who has strong relationships with his community, who sleeps according to natural light and moves freely through the environment, might look at a modern office worker and feel something close to pity. Meanwhile, that office worker has access to antibiotics, anesthesia, modern medicine, refrigeration, electricity, instant communication, and the ability to speak with someone thousands of miles away. From that perspective, the modern human might look backward and feel enormous relief. This is the trap at the center of the entire debate. We keep trying to compare two lifestyles using a single measurement of human happiness. But human flourishing does not work that way. Agriculture eventually made possible things that completely transformed the human experience. Writing, accumulated knowledge, science, medicine, large-scale education, global communication. And perhaps the greatest irony is that we are now using those achievements of civilization to study the ways civilization once made life worse for ancient humans. The criticism of civilization is itself a product of civilization. What agriculture ultimately gave humanity was compounding. Knowledge could be recorded instead of disappearing when a generation died. Ideas could be passed down and improved. Technologies could be refined over centuries. A society could survive a terrible generation and still preserve the knowledge accumulated by those who came before. A small hunter-gatherer group wiped out by disease or violence could lose centuries of ecological knowledge in a single generation. Agriculture was therefore an incredibly harsh bargain for many of the individuals who experienced its earliest stages. But it created the platform upon which almost everything that came later was built. And now we reach the final twist. We never truly stopped being hunter-gatherers. The modern human body sitting at a desk today is fundamentally the same kind of body that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to walk long distances, consume varied foods, sleep according to natural cycles, and maintain close relationships with a relatively small community. That creates a mismatch. Our ancient human biology is now operating inside a radically different environment. And that mismatch may help explain many modern problems. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, chronic back pain, anxiety, loneliness, sleep disorders. These problems are not necessarily random accidents. In many cases, they may represent the biological consequences of living in conditions our bodies never evolved to handle. Early farmers, despite all their difficulties, were still outdoors. They were physically active. They lived according to seasons. They interacted constantly with their environment. Modern humans went through another dramatic transformation. Agricultural life became industrial life. Industrial life became digital life. The farm became the factory. The village became the city. Physical labor became sedentary work. And now much of our day can be spent sitting in front of a screen. So who actually had the better life? The ancient hunter-gatherer had more leisure, a more varied diet, greater social equality, strong community relationships, and a much closer connection with the natural world. The farmer eventually gained greater population stability, more predictable calorie production, and the ability to support increasingly large and complex communities. Those communities would eventually produce the technologies and institutions that define the modern world. Neither lifestyle was easy. Both were different solutions to the same fundamental human problem. How do we survive? But if you push the anthropologists on the evidence, many will tell you an uncomfortable truth. The earliest farmers got a surprisingly bad deal. Not forever. Not across the entire sweep of human history. But for the people who actually lived through those first thousands of years of agriculture, the transition appears to have reduced many measurable aspects of quality of life. And the irony is almost impossible to miss. We now use the products of that difficult transition, universities, scientific research, archaeology, medicine, and technology, to look backward and discover how costly it was. The farmers suffered so that thousands of years later, someone could write a scientific paper demonstrating that they suffered. And yet here we are. More than 8 billion people now live on a planet that could never have supported anything close to that population through hunting and gathering alone. There is no realistic way to return to that ancient human world. And most of us probably would not choose to, even if the opportunity existed. Modern medicine, reliable food, electricity, communication, technology. The extraordinary convenience and complexity of modern civilization. All of it can ultimately be traced back to the moment humans began settling down, cultivating plants, and building permanent communities. But that does not mean we should ignore what came before. There are lessons hidden in the lives of ancient hunter-gatherers that still matter today. Move more. Eat a wider variety of foods. Build strong reciprocal relationships. Spend time outdoors. Reconnect with natural environments. Allow your body to experience natural patterns of light and darkness. These are not simply modern wellness trends. They reflect conditions our biology evolved under for hundreds of thousands of years. And ignoring those biological needs may come with a measurable cost. The hunter-gatherer and the farmer are therefore not just two categories from an ancient history book. They represent two competing forces that still exist inside modern life. On one side, freedom, mobility, connection; on the other, security, accumulation, stability. The desire to build something that lasts. Every person alive today experiences some version of this tension. You can see it in the fantasy of quitting your job and disappearing into nature. And you can see the opposite feeling in the relief of returning home to a solid roof, a stocked refrigerator, and a predictable tomorrow. In a strange way, we are still negotiating the same trade-off our ancient human ancestors encountered around 12,000 years ago along the Euphrates and across the Zagros Mountains. The difference is that we now have better tools, more knowledge, more technology, and somehow considerably worse posture. The debate between the ancient hunter and the farmer was never truly settled. Perhaps it never can be.